Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Ranger Jen. I'm with National Mall and Memorial Parks, and this is part of our Teach 250 series that we've been hosting throughout the school year. Thank you for joining us. We have a really cool presentation this evening. Some special guests and some old friends of mine are here with us today. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We have a lot of cool things to share with you. We'd love it though if you could say hello in the chat, introduce yourself, let us know where you are coming from. If you're a teacher, let us know what you teach, if you don't mind, because we want to make sure we can make this as useful for you as possible. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming. I also have to give a shout out to my friends at the Trust for the National Mall who are hosting us as they do every month. And we wouldn't be able to do all of this, these presentations without their help. So we really appreciate that. Yeah, come on, let's say hi here. We've got a whole bunch of guests on the line, and I'm going to start by turning it over to Claire. Claire is an associate lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. We're going international here, folks. This is really exciting. Where she researches and teaches about American monument culture. Previously an NEH Public Humanities Fellow at St. Mary's College of Maryland and research associate for the Philadelphia-based Public Art and History Studio Monument Lab. Her work has long addressed the role of commemoration in social justice struggles. For the past year, as part of a larger research group at St. Andrews, she's been working closely with the National Park Service at Camp Nelson to explore its significance in reshaping Civil War memory and public understandings of emancipation. So I am going to turn it over to Claire Fisher, and she will let you know about the program and some of the other participants with us tonight. Claire?
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm just going to try and share my screen so we have some visuals. Hopefully that works. Great. Thank you for the introduction, Jen, and for the invitation to be here. It's really great to be here with everybody and part of this program. As Jen mentioned, my name is Claire and I'm an associate lecturer at the University of St. Andrews, where I work as part of a larger group on a project called Commemorative Cultures. And Commemorative Cultures is a digital humanities project that aims to document, map, and interpret American Civil War monuments from around the world. So this includes monuments located in the UK, which do exist, you may be surprised to hear, and of course those found in the US, which may be probably more closer to you. So our goal is to bring together researchers, students, and educators from both sides of the Atlantic to work collectively to uncover the hidden histories of Civil War monuments, as well as create new platforms for teaching and learning. So in this spirit, we've been working closely over this past year with the National Park Service team at Camp Nelson National Monument in Central Kentucky, which is of course the subject of today's session. So before we get started and really dig into things, it would be great to know how many of you have heard of Camp Nelson and its story already. So I'm hoping this might appear as a poll. I don't, it might have closed now. Amazing. So we're kind of a bit of a mix, but majority maybe have heard. So as you'll hear from in more detail very shortly, Camp Nelson was initially established as a US supply depot in 1863, but soon became one of the country's largest recruitment centers for African-American soldiers. So as enlistment was emancipatory for Black men, it became associated with freedom. It also became a key destination for refugees from slavery, Black women and children whose route to freedom was less clear but just as dangerous. So they came to Camp Nelson to seek protection behind US lines and were cast out on multiple occasions. So this complex and subject is central to today's session, which on Lincoln's birthday might actually be seen to challenge his image as a great emancipator, single-handedly granting freedom to the enslaved. So instead, we'd like to emphasize the self-liberatory actions of enslaved individuals at Camp Nelson, and to start talking about some of the ways in which we might incorporate this history into the classroom to help cultivate critical conversations about the Civil War period and its relevance today. So we'll be traveling live to Camp Nelson, looking at specific documents and objects that might form the basis of classroom discussions and activities, as well as signposting you to the growing set of resources we have on offer on the Commemorative Cultures website. So we'd also welcome your input on the future shape of these materials, and so hope to open up into a larger discussion at the end about teaching practices and tools. So just a heads up for that. For now, though, to keep us on track, we've identified two essential questions to help guide us through this session. Firstly, how can we center the voices and actions of enslaved people in our teaching of Civil War history, and why is this important? And secondly, what role might monuments play in their varied forms in shaping and sharing this history today, both inside and outside formal teaching environments? So we think Camp Nelson is a critical case study for exploring these topics and introducing students to a more nuanced history of wartime emancipation that is perhaps given in textbook accounts. So without further ado, I'm now delighted to pass you over to the team on the ground in Camp Nelson, and none other than the superintendent, Ernie Price, to give you a better sense of that history and the site itself. So Ernie, can I pass to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. It's wonderful to see everybody on the chat, and we're very grateful to the Trust for the National Mall and to St. Andrew's Commemorative Culture Program. Because if you answered the poll that you didn't know much about Camp Nelson or hadn't heard about it at all, that's because you're not supposed to have, honestly. If I may be blunt, the U.S. military constructed this camp in 1863 and dismantled it in 1866. And so the landscape was erased of the Camp Nelson history that was here, at least above ground. But more than that was erased. It was actually erased from memory quite intentionally. And I would say within a generation, it was already being forgotten by the 1890s during the Confederate commemoration period. That was also, alive and well here in Central Kentucky, as it was around a lot of our country. It's been fascinating throughout the 20th and now the 21st century to meet people who have lived in Central Kentucky their entire lives and don't know anything about Camp Nelson. It wasn't a battle. It was a place where formerly enslaved people self-determined their futures, including emancipation. And that was not a story that fit the narrative that dominated our nation's memory and legacy in the 1890s and forward. So here, the National Park Service has an amazing opportunity to share this story that was honestly not meant to be shared for 150 years. And now we're able to, so we're excited about that. Just a word about the picture behind me. For those, some of you, I can tell in the chat, have been here. Some of you maybe not. If you walk into our visitor center, this is the room that you would see initially. Our orientation desk, off to the right is a small bookstore. Off to the left, that way, is an audiovisual room where we show a 17-minute film. And behind the desk is a museum. So in a separate building called the Reconstructed Barracks, we have a soldiers exhibit. And I would like to introduce our Chief of Interpretation, Visitor Services, and Education, and a man who also serves as our functioning historian here at Camp Nelson, who is doing the hard work of getting the story out and into the ethos so that we can learn valuable lessons about what our nation has been and what it's becoming from the lessons of Camp Nelson. I'd like to turn it over to Chief of Interpretation, Steve Fan.
Thank you, Ernie. I appreciate the introduction. It's a pleasure and privilege to be with you all here tonight. See a lot of familiar faces from some of our friends located across the country. So it's, again, a privilege for us to be here. And I want to thank Jen from the National Mall, Claire, and our host, the Trust as well, for making this possible. And I guess we'll start, you've got those essential questions there, but let's start with the next poll question. And it's really inspired by one of the questions or comments we get from visitors every single day. You see the visitor center behind Ernie. That's where visitors from across Kentucky, the United States, and even the world come when they visit the park. And explore what we have here. And the big question is, what side did Kentucky side with during the Civil War? The U.S., the Confederate, neutral, or not sure? What are your thoughts on that? And this will really kind of guide the introduction to my thoughts before I turn it to our lead ranger here. All right, wow, yes, that is actually, I was wondering what we were going to get, and it's pretty split here. And I guess the answer to the question officially is the United States, but in the summer of 1863, after the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, the state actually declared neutrality for a short period before it aligned itself with the United States. But one of the most common questions that we get, as I just mentioned, isn't, excuse me, 1861, it wasn't Kentucky a Confederate state? And it's a great opportunity for us to engage with visitors on the complexities of unionism, of emancipation, of the complexities of a border state, a loyal slave state during the Civil War, and also memory as well. And so at Camp Nelson National Monument, and before us, Camp Nelson Heritage Park, managed by Jessamine County, historians, archaeologists, people on the ground have been engaging on these topics, very, very complicated topics with visitors. So I'm going to do a very short overview of Camp Nelson before I turn it over to Ranger Ava. As already mentioned, Camp Nelson was established in 1863 April as a U.S. Army supply depot and an advanced base, a hospital, recruitment and training center to support military operations in this region. Specifically, it fueled and supplied the East Tennessee Campaign in August of 1863, which liberated civilian Unionists in East Tennessee that were suffering under Confederate occupation. And so in many ways, Camp Nelson becomes this site of refuge for people in 1863 through the end of the Civil War. And I think that's critically important. And when we say Camp Nelson, that's the official title of this site. It's really a military base, up to 4,000 acres by the end of the Civil War, hundreds of wooden structures, an elaborate infrastructure to support military operations, but also to support civilians as well, both white civilians in 1863 and then African Americans in 1864 and 1865. And this camp or base will be successful by supporting the East Tennessee Campaign in August of 63, recruiting 7 white regiments in Kentucky, including Kentucky and East Tennessee regiments. But the future of this site was pretty murky in 1864 as military operations shifted to the South and the Carolinas. And this site was almost shut down until really the spring and summer of 1864, as the war is getting deeper and more costly and the Army needs more men. And the question of Black manpower comes into, becomes a major contention or thought of contention in this state and other states across the country. And this is Camp Nelson's dramatic transformation in 1864, when it becomes one of the largest recruitment and training center for African American soldiers, the largest of 8 sites in Kentucky and the 3rd largest in the country. And we're proud to say the largest surviving United States colored troop recruiting and training center left in the United States today. And we're very, very proud of that. And our predecessors from the county that did so much work here that kind of laid the foundation for the National Park Service to be here. We follow in the footsteps of soldiers and their families. And I think it's critically important. We're in February of 2025, which is part of the 160th anniversary. This site reveals the complexities of the United States, of freedom, of emancipation, of unionism, of loyalty. In 1864, as the Army enlists African American men at Camp Nelson and other sites in the state, they are not alone. They'll be joined by their families and other enslaved people unfit for military service, and they will be considered refugees. And on multiple occasions in 1864, the Army, the same Army that enlists their men, their husbands, their sons, their brothers, will expel their families. resulting in the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of people. And that will cause a national outcry and thankfully lead to some good, which will be the establishment of the Home for Colored Refugees at Camp Nelson. During this time, 160 years ago, early 1865 is when you see the Home for Colored Refugees being established and developed at Camp Nelson. The government will also change policy, allowing enslaved people, freedom seekers, refuge at places like Camp Nelson behind U.S. lines. And by the summer of 1865, there's over 3,000 refugees here. And the final thing I'll say about this is nationally significant, right? Camp Nelson became one of the newest units of the National Park Service in October of 2018. And the stories and the experiences and the perspectives of the people here are critically important to our understanding of American history and of our country here today. On March 3rd, 1865, in order to increase enlistment, Congress passes legislation which emancipates the wives and children of U.S. colored troops. So in many cases, in many ways, we like to say, and I think it's critically important, the power of this site, Camp Nelson is the destruction of slavery in Kentucky. And that's why this site is nationally significant. And we've got thousands and thousands of stories to share here. So I appreciate that. And with that, I turn it over to Ranger Ava.
Thanks, Steve. Wow, hard to follow that up for sure. But hello, everybody. My name is Ranger Ava, and it's a true honor and privilege to be here, part of this webinar, and to get to talk to you about how unique and important and special Camp Nelson is. Claire, if you don't mind, if you want, we can go ahead and take our viewers to see some photographs. It's a little hard to do on site when it's currently dark outside in the Eastern time zone. But myself and Ranger Steve are actually inside of the barracks, our soldiers exhibit. It's incredibly interactive, and it has so many great examples of different people that were here, soldiers, civilian employees, and even women and women of color. But we talk about how important this site is and how so much happened. So what do you see when you get here? We are incredibly lucky that there are over 40 historic photographs that were taken by the War Department of Camp Nelson. And that's actually what we're looking at right now. And even though this may not look like much, this is truly one of the most important images that we have, because this is essentially kind of an expanded view of what was called the Home for Colored Refugees. So after that final expulsion in 1864, you have these African-American women and children, those unfit for military service, are able to come back into camp, and you start to have the construction of cottages that, you have about 100 of these wooden cottages that are filled very quickly by freedom seekers, and they fill so fast that you start to have the expansion of this home with all of these tents and even kind of hand-built structures that you see farther to the left. And so this is going to be one of those really important images connecting us to help us visualize what was happening here, what did this landscape look like, and what did people experience. So our next photo is also another one of my favorites. You have a schoolhouse for refugees coming into camp. And I like to imagine that this is just a small little snapshot of how many education-eager people are flooding the classroom. You have children that are coming during the day, but you also have adults that are coming at night as well. And we talk about that self-agency that African Americans are showing on a daily basis, seeking their freedom, seeking a better future for themselves and their family. And education is a part of that emancipation as well. Often having to learn in secret, having to essentially be a part of what's called clandestine schooling, where passing on knowledge quietly, where you might get in trouble or you might be punished for such an action, never stopped them. They were so hungry to learn. And so really these schoolhouses were, our schoolhouse was here, but that was really just to supplement the education that they had already gained for themselves, if possible. And so you have this fantastic image of students all in front of the schoolhouse that was right there where the Home for Colored Refugees was. And our next picture. And so this is Main Street. We're looking down that main row of wooden cottages that was at the Home for Colored Refugees. And some of my favorite parts of being able to use these historic images to connect visitors and students during educational programs is if you look, kids will see people that are their age right there inside of these images. You see a ton of children, as well as women and men inside these photographs. And, you know, we can see a bit of detail in some of the women's faces in the, you know, the far bottom right corner. We've got a man on horseback, and you have all of these freedom seekers coming forward to have their photo taken. And so that was our historic kind of side of Camp Nelson, you know, this massive, you know, military installation that was over 4,000 acres in size. And you have this part that is essentially creating the story of freedom and the end of slavery in Kentucky with our historic images. And so our next photo doesn't look like much today, but we also enjoyed kind of getting to use the landscape as, you know, this lasting legacy of the site. So this is a modern day image that was taken from the National Cemetery, which is historically a part of Camp Nelson, but today it's run by the Veterans Affairs Administration. But if you notice, there's a large 2-story white house in the back image. Now this is a picture that was taken today, but the next photo shows us what it would have looked like when Camp Nelson was active as a military installation, supply depot. So we're actually looking at a bustling ambulance yard. As a supply depot, you're going to have a ton of materials that are being produced at a wild level to help supply the U.S. Army and its soldiers. But we have this amazing blending of the landscape today, how we see it, how you would see it if you come and visit, please do, and what we, you know, that historic landscape that we're able to overlay to really help people broaden their imagination. Because when we say, you know, this was a massive depot and there's, you know, it could accommodate up to 14,000 animals and you have all of these troops and all of these freedom seekers coming, that's hard to imagine. You know, we can try to create an image in our head, but blending these historic resources with the modern day is a great way to really have folks understand how this landscape has changed over time. So our next photo, thanks Claire. We have kind of another overlay here featuring more children. So you've got some horses, you have some men further in the back. You also have what could be maybe a dog, maybe a pig with our 2 little kids up front. But this is just going to be one of the over 300 structures that are constructed by the U.S. Army here. And so this is that historic image. And when we look at the next one, we can kind of see and imagine what it would have looked like on the landscape. That road right there, even though it's a small loop 2 road today, that would have been the main access into Camp Nelson, north and south. And our next historic picture. So this is our grain shed, and it is absolutely bolt to bursting. We can see it almost looks like the walls are bending. But if you have this many animals that are being used for cavalry, for artillery, for even transporting all of these supplies to and from, another big part of that is making sure that they're taken care of and that you have enough to have their operations go smoothly. And so if we go to the next image, we can kind of see what we're looking at today. You have that same road that leads up to the White House and you have the historic fencing there. So truly, when visitors come and see us today, it doesn't seem like much. It's very calm, it's very peaceful. You have the green rolling hills, of course. But when we talk about how hustling and bustling and busy and noisy and, you know, all these animals, how smelly this site was on a daily basis, it really is kind of hard to wrap your mind around. And that's why, you know, having these historic images and getting, you know, visitors and students out on the grounds during hikes and showing them these locations is such a great way to bring this story that is so important to life and really helping them connect with that. And I think I turn it back to you, Claire.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic, seeing how historic it overlays in the landscape. So as we now know, Camp Nelson was a site of slavery and emancipation, a center for Black enlistment, and also a destination for refugees fleeing slavery. The tragic expulsion of 1864, which Steve mentioned briefly, when over 400 Black women and children were fatally cast out, lies at the heart of Camp Nelson's history as well, a history that contains both horror and hope. So when approaching such content in the classroom then, we've been influenced by the advice of the Southern Poverty Law Centre, who have stressed the challenges but also the necessity of teaching hard history. As you can see about American slavery, they write that it is hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it, hard to discuss the violence that sustained it, and hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. Yet, as this brief extract from their 2018 report concludes, finding possibility within this history requires us to consider the lives of the enslaved on their own terms. So with this in mind, we're going to spend some time now spotlighting a couple of resources that you might want to introduce into lessons alongside the sort of photographs as well, to help teach about the Civil War and the long civil rights struggle that center the stories of enslaved people and their ancestors at Camp Nelson. As Ava mentioned, taking students on field trips to Kentucky is of course encouraged if you're based in the area and able to interact with the landscape in that way. But bringing primary sources into the classroom is another way in which we might close the distance and foster a more immediate engagement with the historical actors at Camp Nelson. So again, another quick question for you all. How many of you already use primary sources in your lessons? Quite often, in some cases, 50% often, sometimes 29%, and hardly is 14%, but no one's never. So that's a good sign. So hopefully we can draw upon some of those experiences when we talk about some examples which are specific to Camp Nelson. The first object that we wanted to share is a pierced silver coin that was discovered at the former refugee site at Camp Nelson during an archaeological excavation in the 1990s. But anyone who has perhaps thought of objects before, perhaps knows that it's often useful to lead with questions rather than context. The sorts of questions that hook students' interest and prior experiences and knowledge. Has anyone seen anything like this before, for example? Does this look familiar? For younger students, passing around a modern dime might also spark the same curiosity and connection, offering a way of making distant things more relatable. So this coin, we hope, could maybe form the basis of an object interview activity that engages students' basic observation skills and encourages them to draw larger conclusions about historical contexts. You'll find that museums are often a great resource for this and often provide lists of questions that can facilitate and guide this activity. My favorites include the Peabody Museum's Guide to Looking and the Material Studies Association's 20 Questions to Ask an Object. I can't access the chat box right now, but I will probably post those in at the end. So both these resources encourage students to describe the object in great detail, taking note of its materiality, its condition, size, shape, as well as it questioning whether they think it might be mass-produced or unique, and also what relationship it has to its maker. So this kind of question-driven process and analysis serves as a useful entry point, as I'm sure many of you know, for discussion, and can create critical lines of inquiry. The hope being that students might start to generate their own questions and theories about the object and its status. So we'd love to hear some of yours in the chat box if you could just jot down any initial observations or thoughts about this object. And then hopefully I can pass it over to Steve and Ava to provide a bit more context and world building around this particular coin.
Claire, one comment is wondering why it is pierced. Why is there a hole?
It's a very good question.
Appears to have been minted in 1857, resembles a dime, may have been hung on a chain.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole kind of makes it wearable in some way, potentially.
How was the hole created?
That is a good question. Maybe one for Steve and Ava.
Looks like stars around the edge.
Okay.
These are all really great observations. Noticed what appears to be a wreath in the circumference.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've got like our wreath of stars.
Very good observations.
Mhm.
And go ahead, Ava. You want to talk more about this?
What is the black marking at the top of the coin?
Yeah,
these are really important observations. Claire, are you okay if I go ahead and hop in and kind of talk about this?
Please do.
All right, well, everybody's pretty much right on the money, literally. This is a half dime, and we do have the date 1857 at the bottom, and we do have kind of a wreath of stars, may have been 13 stars. So we do have those going around, and then the black marking at the top is singeing, is burned, and there is damage, but that little hole really is kind of the most important part of this dime story. Dimes or half dimes oftentimes were used as a good luck charm, almost to ward off any bad spirits or bad luck. And so when excavations were being done of Camp Nelson, this was found at one of the earliest refugee sites or refugee encampments. And, a hard part of that story is that there are at least 8 that we know of forced expulsions of African-American refugees outside of Camp Nelson, including women and children, the wives and, the daughters and sons, and family members of USCTs that are enlisting here, self-emancipating and fighting for the US Army, and their families are being driven out. So we have this really powerful quote from Gertrude Volker. And it says, "Every one of my children wears a silver dime on a string around their leg to keep off the witch's spell." So this is such a powerful primary resource that we actually have in our museum exhibits. And so we could ask students or visitors, what does this mean to you? Or what does this look like? And we could start having that conversation about what they think, and we can connect it with the Camp Nelson story. Oftentimes when women are coming into the camp, maybe following their husbands or brothers or family members, they are not included in this emancipation. When a young, able-bodied African-American man signs his name and joins the U.S. Army, he is then free. But initially, that does not include any of his family members. So just like had been said earlier with Steve and Ernie and Claire, they are incredibly vulnerable when they're here in camp. And so you have a lot of agency being shown by women of color who are going out on a daily basis to find ways to help and support the United States Army. You will have many of them become cooks and washerwomen. And they do this to find essentially another way that they can try to protect themselves and protect their children, because every day is uncertain. It really comes down to the mood of the commandant or any orders that may be coming that they don't know of. And so when we see this dime, I can almost imagine a mother kind of worrying the coin between her fingers, feeling those stars, and then feeling the date at the bottom, and essentially piercing a piece of money. You can imagine, someone who has gone from being enslaved to this very uncertain day-to-day experience, but their children and protecting their children is so important that they're piercing money, and putting it on their children. And that is so much more important than having that half dime in your wallet. And so this is, a mother caring about her child. It's just one extra step aside from her getting up every day and washing uniforms or anything that the Army asks of her. This is another way that she can at least try to protect her child. And we could use so many ways to talk about that culturally, about how does your family take care of each other? Is there a keepsake that's been passed down from a relative that you love very much? Or what do you hold that's important? These tiny little coins, tiny but mighty, are essentially a mother's hopes and dreams for her child that she's willing to put on their wrist. And that singeing is evidence of those expulsions. And it can be really heartbreaking when we think about our own parents, or if you have your own children, and how much you care about them and you want to take care of them and you hope that their future is infinitely better than yours. But there's also a ton of resiliency and hope, I feel, inside this object, because of course a mother is going to do anything she can, whether somebody might think it's silly, or they might not believe that there's bad luck or a witch's spell. It doesn't matter. That mother is going to do everything she can to give their child the better future and to try to protect them. And that is a huge current of Camp Nelson's, when you put your finger on the pulse of it, that bravery and that determination in the face of all of this uncertainty and fear is just so incredibly powerful, all inside of a coin that's the size of a dime. So this is a really powerful resource to get to talk about and to physically get to see when you're here.
Yeah, and I'd add something really quick. This is there were thousands of soldiers or men that joined the military at Camp Nelson, and we have a lot of military records, which Claire and I will talk about in a second here. This is a story. Someone wore this, right? And in many cases, this is connection to people that were here, especially women and children who often did not have the opportunity to share their perspectives and stories, right? And one of the questions that we see here, what is the black marking at the top of the coin? This is the hope and despair of Camp Nelson all at the same time, right? Freedom seekers coming into U.S. lines, able-bodied men freeing themselves by joining the army, but this very precarious situation for their families. And after the November 23rd, 1864 expulsion, the final expulsion of Black refugees, over 400 U.S. soldiers were instructed to basically set fire to their housing, makeshift shacks and things like that. And archaeologists here, led by Dr. Steve McBride, found a lot of items that were burned, including this coin. So yeah, in many ways, I find a lot of inspiration from this coin because a child likely wore this, but it also shows that how they were treated, and who knows what happened to that person when they are expelled from Camp Nelson. And so in many ways, you can glean a lot from a simple artifact as this coin.
Great. Yeah, I think that really kind of lines up the kind of the next kind of primary document that we wanted to share with you, which also kind of offers that larger opportunity to think about why protection was needed and the role of US officials at Camp Nelson in both providing and withdrawing it. So this next document that we thought we'd share today speaks directly to this issue, and it is the affidavit of Sergeant Joseph Miller. Given an account of that 1984 expulsion, when US officers expelled hundreds of Black women and children from the camp's grounds, Miller's family included his wife Isabella, and 3 children, Joseph, Calvin, and Maria, were amongst them. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes to read and reflect on this extract. If you want to add any kind of sections or sentences that stand out in the chat to you, then please do. But otherwise, we'll just give you a couple of minutes to read through.
I will.
Great. I hope everyone's finished reading. Steve, I don't know if you want to fill in a bit more context with this document.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. We talk so much about the purpose or importance of primary resources, especially at a place like Camp Nelson. we hear from the people themselves, right? A gentleman like Joseph Miller, who was 45 years old actually when he is self-emancipated by joining the U.S. Army at Camp Nelson. He served with the 124th U.S. Colored Infantry, as you can see there, which was actually organized as an invalid regiment, organized for young boys and men that were physically unfit to serve actively in the field. And you can see by his age, 45 is pretty old, right? And like a lot of Black men, he was not alone. He came, as Claire mentioned, with his family, his wife and 3 children. And you can really start breaking this down. And that's what I would do with your students is, let's read this. This is a personal account. First and foremost, it's an affidavit from an African-American soldier. And I was just reading Eric Bonner's Reconstruction book right before this, and he talked about how the military provides African-American soldiers a higher sense of equality, not true full equality. He calls it military equality in a way. Specifically, they could like testify in military tribunals in court cases. They could also share things like affidavits, which we get from several U.S. colored troop soldiers after the expulsion, because it directly impacts their families. First and foremost, the first paragraph talks about, him joining the Army at Camp Nelson in October of '64, and he's joined by his family because he wants to protect them. And this is a very common story we hear from U.S. colored troop soldiers that come to, or men that join the U.S. colored troop at Camp Nelson, is many join with the promise that they could take care of their families. And he joins in the middle of October, and by the 23rd of November, and he tries to stop it, as you can see. I was told I could take care of my family. I'm a soldier of the United States. And he was told it does not make a difference. And 400 refugees, the wives and children of Black soldiers, are literally driven out by the same army that enlisted their fathers and husbands and sons, right? That's incredibly horrific in many ways. And it felt like a broken promise for so many of these men and their families. And like I think a lot of parents would do, he went in search of his family and went back and forth between Nicholasville and Camp Nelson. And the next day had to bury one of his children. And the order was rescinded within a couple of days, but the impact was truly deadly. Over 100 people died as a direct result of the final expulsion. And as Jasmine asked on there, did Miller's other children die as a result? Yes. The entire family passes away in the aftermath of the expulsion of Camp Nelson. So Isabella, his wife, and his 3 children all die. And then Joseph passes away on January 6, 1865 at Camp Nelson General Hospital. And before I turn it back to Claire, this is why this legislation on March 3rd, 1865 is so critically important, because it emancipates the wives and children of soldiers, right? So when a husband enlists, their family is free as well. Their women, their wives and children, and that's critically important. And this is national legislation. So when we talk about the national significance of Camp Nelson, it's in response to what happened with the expulsion. And the Army makes comments about this. They're like, wow, after March 3rd, enlistment is rising. Well, clearly, the men could take care of themselves and their families. So turn it back over to you, Claire. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the context. So yeah, we'd love to hear a bit from you and the audience about how you might approach teaching this material in the classroom. So please do jot down any thoughts in the chat box. Of course, one approach is to resist immediate analysis and to sit with these painful descriptions. And though we don't have the names of the majority of women and children who died as a result of the expulsion, Miller's account stops us from seeing them as undifferentiated and unknown. And as Steve mentioned with primary sources, and using them in the classroom, asking who the audience is for the text serves as a useful opener for students, encouraging them to think about the document's relationship to the broader social and political circumstances, as well as its impact. This can then lead on to questions about language and how does language affect how the message is received? What purpose does this document still serve? Another more historically aligned question you might want to use with students might be, what does this text tell us about Black enlistment and the impact on soldiers' families in Kentucky? For students at a higher level, modeling annotation might be a useful approach here. As you read as a class, you might highlight, sorry, I forgot to share the headstone that is present in Camp Nelson National Cemetery of Joseph Miller. Yeah, in a classroom, I think, again, encouraging to go to Camp Nelson is of course important, but in a classroom context and using primary sources, modeling annotation can sometimes work effectively as a useful approach. And you might highlight the reasons Miller gives for his family joining him at Camp Nelson, the fear of retaliation from enslavers and the intensified danger that this creates for Black women, or underscore sections that expose white US officers as untrustworthy, and that Miller's own status as a soldier didn't necessarily guarantee the safety of his family. So talking students through your process of close reading and annotation, underlying, as I say, particular words that stand out, or noting down questions that the text presents for you, will hopefully encourage them to do the same, and with the same degree of intentionality and mindfulness when it comes to future analysis. So, I guess in the interest of time, once students have developed an understanding of Camp Nelson's significance during the Civil War period through documents like these, it's possible to move on to discussions onto the topic of commemoration and make connections to the present. So how does Camp Nelson National Monument reshape conventional perceptions of Civil War monuments, for example? Why was Camp Nelson largely forgotten after the war, as Ernie mentioned at the beginning? And how and why is the history of the expulsion being commemorated now? So as the country's 250th approaches, such questions of memory and commemoration will become all the more pertinent and offer compelling opportunities for critical thinking. So returning to the Commemorative Cultures Project, we hope to be able to support educators on that mission. So you'll find these discussion prompts, the objects and documents we've discussed today on the website's dedicated Camp Nelson page, alongside a new digital exhibit titled Footsteps to Freedom, which will be collaborating with the team at Camp Nelson. So this multi-chapter exhibit, a full version of which is due to launch soon, offers an alternative way for students to explore the encampment from afar. Anchored in an interactive 1866 map of the site featuring clickable locations, it is designed to invite users to explore in depth the history of particular places around the camp. For example, you can read small snippets about the Home for Refugees or the USCT barracks, and get a sense of the site's historical landscape, as Ava mentioned with the photographs, through virtual reconstructions, learning about key figures and events that took place both within and beyond the camp's bounds. So what I'm showing you now is the barracks site, which, like most of the sites, consists of 7 to 8 short info points that can be easily assigned for homework, I'd like to think, or explored within a class period. There's also a sort of questions to consider activity at the end of each site. So paired with more developed lesson plans, our aim is for the exhibit and the resource library to facilitate the incorporation of Camp Nelson's history into classrooms and help students reach a more comprehensive understanding of its Civil War past and commemorative future. But it's still a work in progress, and we would benefit massively from your feedback and the opportunity to work collaboratively with teachers in the US at varying grade levels to ensure we are assisting in the most effective way. So in that spirit, we'd love to hear a bit more from you for this final sort of 5-10 minutes. And we've created a discussion board and feedback questionnaire on a Padlet. So we'd be grateful if you could either scan the QR code or click the link in the chat to join us on the Padlet and share ideas and questions, and maybe for the next 5 minutes, and then we can return to the Zoom screen and answer any immediate questions you have for us here. Sorry, I will just share the link in the chat now.
Are you ready for any questions if anybody has them? Anybody has anything you want to ask right now? Here's your chance. I feel like we got a trip to Camp Nelson tonight. This was pretty cool.
We could give you a spin around the room if you ever want, Ranger Jen.
Hey, I've been there. Claire, can you share the link to the lesson plans on the Commemorative Cultures website?
Any questions so far?
Hi, Jeffrey. Were there many accounts of superstitions among the residents? Could you expand on that a little bit more? Are you meaning the African American residents that were kind of making encampments? The fear of witches example. Oh, for example, okay. The fear of witches, for example. So
Yeah.
that's a great question.
That's a part of that. The bracelet. I mean,
Right.
coin.
The coin. So, I mean, that's a fantastic question. So, you know, unfortunately, we don't have any primary sources that kind of go into that detail about any sort of like folklore or superstition exactly. We do have a lot of resources and accounts that talk about how very active, African Americans were in religious sermons, and very, very, they were very, very active in attending services that were being done by the American Missionary Association, even amongst themselves. Prayer, song, storytelling were, of course, very big parts of their culture. But unfortunately, we don't have any specific primary resources other than that quote that we showed for the halftime that we know exists today. But I can imagine that there are many families and many communities that kind of use these stories, through oral traditions. A lot of stuff is being passed down by word of mouth from family member to their descendants. And so a lot of these stories and ideas still exist today, when we get to work with descendants. If you go down the road today from here at Camp Nelson to the Hall community where the Home for Colored Refugees was, a really powerful thing that you can experience. And if students go, say, for a field trip and they see this, small historic white church, the Fee Memorial Church, every house that's on that little square, if you knock on the door, you will meet a descendant of a USCT or a refugee seeking their freedom from Camp Nelson. So, we talk about living history and we imagine like cannons being fired and, mules pulling a wagon. But they are the living history of this site. They're the lasting legacy of all of these experiences, even if we don't know the names. We may not know them specifically, but their memory is still living today. Their experience has not been forgotten. It's been, validated, and we try to honor that. And it's a really big responsibility, but we're incredibly fortunate to have a growing number of descendants who are finding out about their families' histories that connect here at Camp Nelson.
Yeah, I'd add to Dr. Kim and Steve McBride here that did so much work with the county over like literally 30 years. They've talked about this button with the X on it, which is connected to African American religious beliefs all the way back to West Africa. So there's that, and that's found through archaeology, right? In Camp Nelson, so many of our stories are told through archaeology and the work that was done by Dr. McBride and his team and archaeologists over the past 30 years. So I want to answer a couple of these questions. Did refugees and enlistees come from other parts of the country? Mostly Kentucky, and especially because the Army starts enlisting African American men in 1864, which is really interesting because Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, these states around Kentucky begin enlisting Black men in 1863. So there are thousands of Black Kentuckians that actually left the state to, especially men, to join the U.S. military. But we have found accounts through enlistment records, again, primary sources, of Black men from Tennessee, Ohio, and other places that will join the U.S. colored troops at bases across the state. As I said, there was 8 of them. Aurora, great question about the types of food. And again, this gets back to military records and archaeology as well, the work done by, which is featured actually in our museum as well. We have an archaeology room, and through a lot of the archaeological surveys and excavations, they found different types of foods that refugees were eating, and including people that had to basically go find and forage for themselves. And then refugees that were issued government rations at the Home for Colored Refugees. One of the really positive things or helpful things for historians and people today is the Army kept really good records, including ration records. So we do have accounts of that. And according to what Dr. McBride has shared with us, is the refugees that foraged for themselves and bartered and things like this were healthier than the refugees that were issued government rations. Yeah, let's see what else. Jill's question, where did African Americans go after the Civil War? Well, at Camp Nelson, there was this Black community that was formed, now known as Ariel, today known as the Hall community. There are still descendants that live in this community, and it's right down the street from us. The park has 7 acres on the other side of US 27. A lot of African Americans formed communities after the Civil War all over the state, including Huntertown and places near Perryville, Lexington, all over the area here, and others, especially as we get into the late 1860s, 1870s, because of the lack of opportunities and racial violence, actually head west in other directions, including Camp Nelson soldiers and former refugees become exodusters and help and actually travel west into Kansas and set up these Black establishments and settlements out west. So you can imagine the range is actually quite wide. Are there any other questions? Yeah, please.
These have all been so great. I could see how we could stay on here a long time. So Jasmine, thank you so much for the comment. Perhaps are there efforts to teach this kind of Black history in neighboring schools and communities? I know Kentucky public schools don't have a large African-American population, so the desire may be low, but important to teach nonetheless. Absolutely. So that is why we've been so excited to partner with, St. Andrews and Clare, because this commemorative cultures exhibit is, we're just excited to see how much more accessible the site will be. As far as our education program, it's growing, which is very exciting. When it was a county site, there were many, many different field trips. But now that it's within the National Park Service, we're going out to our local schools. We've been reaching out to, Jessamine County and beyond to just, let folks know, let teachers and administrators know that, we are a fee-free site that's right down the road, and that, we are able to be very flexible, depending on where the students are in their learning plan. We do have some very hard stories to talk about, but there are still ways that we can incorporate every grade level. And, we totally understand where schools are right now. Kentucky is this way. I know it's a lot of other places, but transportation and funding for that is incredibly hard. And sometimes you might have one day in the entire year that your bus driver is in and that your funding is worked out, and then it snows, or then it rains, or it just falls through. So a big move that we've been, advocating and trying to get out there is, if you can't come to us, we will be more than happy to come to you, to have a ranger in the classroom, bringing Camp Nelson in a box to bring the history to the students in the classroom, or doing this virtually, kind of like we're doing now. There's so many ways we can connect students of a variety of different backgrounds, of a variety of different economic, social, levels to the story here, because there's so many universal feelings and themes that are a part of the Camp Nelson story. So we are just trying to essentially reach out to as many local schools as possible to let them know about this resource. A lot of times, history can be one of those subjects. It's make or break, and we have amazing teachers here in Kentucky. But we're really excited to see that expand. And there are so many different ways that students can engage with the site, with the resources here. A big part of our story is that there are a lot of things happening on the ground level, a lot of advocacy, and a lot of determination being done grassroots amongst individual people. Today, and the kids are kind of in a similar boat. They may think, I'm too young, I'm too little. How can I grow? How can I make a difference? What part can I play in history? And there are all of those different resources here that can help them connect to that as well.
That's it. So Robin,
one
you
more
asked the
question?
question, why do we use the word refugee? That's the actual word the U.S. government used. Because these people had a very precarious status. As we mentioned, Kentucky is a Union state. It's a loyal slave state. And so slavery is protected by both state and federal law in Kentucky. And unlike places like Virginia or the Deep South, the Carolinas, even Virginia, I think some people are coming from the DC area here. If an enslaved person comes in from Virginia, they're considered contraband of war, because Virginia is in rebellion. Kentucky is not in rebellion. And so slavery is protected here. That's why when refugees, that's what the Army called them, came into places like Camp Nelson, they were actually still considered fugitive slaves, actually. And they are still susceptible to be re-enslaved, jailed, and things like that. So that is why we use the term refugees, because that's the official term the military used. And we talked about the Home for Called Refugees. That was the official name of this site that was developed to support African-American refugees at Camp Nelson during the Civil War. And exactly, they were freeing enslavement, absolutely.
Thank you all so much. I feel like we could keep going, but you know, maybe we'll have a part 2 when your website goes up and everything's out in the open. And if people want to comment more, I'm sure the folks at Camp Nelson and Claire would love any feedback that you have to offer. We really appreciate everything. It's been really cool. There's great comments in the chat. I hope you're all seeing this. We are thrilled to have you as part of our Teach 250. We see this as an expansion of our 250 years and continuing that story. And so we're really happy to have you. Claire, quick comment before we go. I mean, we're kind of running late here, so we need to wrap it up. But if anybody, I'll give you a chance if you have anything else you wanted to add before we go.
Sorry,
I
was
think you're still on mute. There you go.
Oh, sorry. No, just to say thank you so much for having us. It's been wonderful to be here and to hear everyone's comments and sort of questions have been really engaging and fascinating. And yeah, as I say, hopefully we can continue the conversation and see everyone again soon. But yeah, thanks Jen for everything, and Stephen, Ava and Ernie, and Gabby at the National Trust.
Yeah,
Thank you,
it's
Jen.
been wonderful.
Jen, if
Thanks,
you don't
Jen.
mind,
Thanks, Claire.
kind of final thought here, because I know there's so many educators. I know there's volunteers that work for the Park Service here as well. One of the things I want you to take away, I challenge you, is kind of reframe your thought on what Civil War monument means, right? Because there's stone markers on battlefields and in front of courthouses and places like that. But monument also means people, stories, landscapes, right? And that's exactly what we do at places like Camp Nelson. And so, you know, maybe use, you know, people are very passionate about Civil War monuments and things like that. Of course, use that as kind of an entry point, and then dive deeper if you could. I challenge you all to do that as educators, and thank you for all you do. You're inspiring the next generation. We appreciate the time.
Great. Thank you for that, Steve and Ava and Claire and Ernie. Thank you to the Trust for the National Mall again for hosting us. We really enjoyed the conversation. And if you haven't been, I hope you get a chance to go to Camp Nelson sometime soon. They're ready for you. So yes, please let us know if you have questions and comments, and we'd be happy to pass on any information to our presenters tonight. And come back for March 11th. We're gonna talk to the National Portrait Gallery as part of our series here about monument makers. In March, we're going to talk about women, so it's going to be really exciting. Anyway, thank you all so much, and we'll talk to you all soon, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you,
Take care.
everybody.
Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.